Well, thank you all for coming. This is my attempt to do my ARNIE talk and give it a dry run prior to my actual talk live tomorrow at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth. The hope is that this talk will allow students who might not be able to attend and others who might have interest in this talk, and also to see if I can do it in approximately 20 to 25 minutes. So the title of my talk is A Changing Climate, Rising Seas, and Human Institutions, the Strangest of Bedfellows. The purpose of the talk is to look at climate change from the policy perspective, but specifically through the lens of incentives, to look at how different groups that might be engaged in climate change, including the public, some institutions and politicians in particular, and how those incentives can drive outcomes that might seem irrational within the context of doing something about climate change. The goal is to hopefully provide a sort of context for thinking about how we as humans approach problems that are like climate change, that are difficult to understand, difficult to predict, where most of the damage or costs are incurred over time and into the future. To provide the context, I'd like to start with a few questions. And the questions are based on this context of what I would do versus what I will do. If you saw a problem, would you fix it? Would you do something today to prevent harm tomorrow? Would you use relevant information in making an important decision? For most of us, these three questions seem pretty simple. For example, if you saw a problem, would you fix it? Most of us would probably say yes. It might be a conditional yes, but yes, if I saw something that I would define as a problem and I had the capacity to do something, I would do something to fix it. Now, thinking about that a little bit more, we might say to ourselves, well, I might be willing to fix it so long as the cost to fix it does not exceed any benefits that accrue to me. Those benefits do not have to be individual. I can get benefits out of helping society at large, right? I can see benefits in that, and I can yield good feelings and other things. It doesn't have to be direct economic or monetary benefit to myself. But again, within some sort of contextual constraints, we can say that, most of us would say that if we saw a problem, we would probably do something to fix it, or at least we would say we would do something to fix it. The second question, would you do something today to prevent harm tomorrow? Now, most of us would, again, intuitively say yes. We would say, look, I definitely am interested in my well-being, not just in the moment, but also in the future. And so I would take measures today, take steps today to ensure my personal well-being for tomorrow and days after. Now, the extent to which you would be willing to sacrifice certain things today for benefits tomorrow is, again, contextual. And there's been plenty of research to show that the context varies based on a number of circumstances, based on sort of part of our personality, a little bit of our upbringing, sort of our nature and our nurture, but also other interesting things like where we are in our lifespan. Are we younger? Might be more risk. Younger people tend to, as a group, on average, be more risk-seeking. Older people tend to be more risk-averse. So again, it's an answer that I think most of us would be able to say, again, on average, that we would be willing to do something today to prevent some harm tomorrow. We would want to know, again, things about that harm. Does it accrue to us? Does it accrue to others? How much do I have to spend today? What do I have to do? How do I have to restrict myself today? Those sort of things. And then finally, would you use relevant information in making an important decision? Most of us, especially if we happen to be in school, graduate students, I would say researchers, academics, certainly within that group, that subpopulation of our general population, we would tend to say that yes, obviously relevant information is important and vital in making important decisions. So of course, relevant suggests that the information is directed towards making that important decision. Again, this is somewhat contextual. We would use relevant information, but sometimes, and we have to think about this, even important relevant information cannot be very helpful sometimes in how we see or perceive the world. Sometimes our heuristics is a term that's often used, or our worldviews. We want relevant information to inform our decisions, but many times we're willing to discount relevant information when that information is an inconvenient piece of information for us, when it doesn't really help solve a riddle that we're looking to solve, or sometimes if the information goes against what we believe to be true, or something that we've believed in for a long period of time. And many times those beliefs can take, again, to contextualize or give an illustrative example, if I've spent most of my life investing a good sum of my money in a particular company, investing my income in this company as a means of securing my financial well-being in later life for retirement purposes, I may be more willing to discount information that's negative about that company. It's incredibly relevant to me because I might have a very substantial sum at stake, an investment of significant proportion for myself in this particular company, but because of my past decisions and the fact that I am so invested, and it doesn't have to be a company, by the way, because it could be something where it's difficult for me to remove that investment, right? Something that I'm stuck with, and the degree to which my sort of worldview wants to support my previous decisions, I might be more willing to discount new information, and I think most of us can understand that in context. So the problem with climate change, we're going to look at these three sort of questions, and we're going to look at the problem of climate change and apply it to different sort of incentives from different individuals and what we've learned about that recently. But the problem with climate change, it occurs over time. Climate change is not here, it's not one singular event that we can identify with. It isn't caused by one singular thing, so it's disparate and dispersed. It's disparate in terms of it's not just one thing, and it's dispersed in terms of it occurring over a long period of time. And that's problematic because it's hard for us to wrap our heads around and to really understand the seriousness and significance of the issue. To use an example, I mean, there's really good information out there on the problems with smoking and cigarettes, for example, and some of the diseases, lung disease and associated problems that are caused by cigarette smoking, carcinogens, etc., that are in cigarettes. And this is well known, and the information is entirely relevant, and it's especially relevant to smokers. But lifelong smokers, one of the problems with dealing with that information, internalizing and making decisions about not to smoke, for example, is that smoking, by definition, most of those harms, they occur over a long period of time. And they're not immediate, they're not direct, and they're not singular in their sort of effect. So having a cigarette today doesn't necessarily identify the absolute likelihood of my getting lung cancer or any of the other ailments that might go along with smoking cigarettes. And climate change is not unlike that in the sense that whatever behaviors might be identified as negative behaviors towards climate change, something that I guess would be something that would reinforce the phenomenon of climate change. If those behaviors are things that we already do, then it's very difficult to think about climate change because of its sort of temporal component, this sort of occurring over time and being disparate in nature. Also, it creates an uncertain future. We don't know under climate change what that future is. We've never experienced that future, and most of the evidence suggests it'll be a different future than what we've experienced, at least in terms of near human history, in our past, the past few thousand years. Climate change will provide us with something that is relatively new in modern human history. So it's not like the past. And then the harm is shared by everyone. So one of the main problems with climate change is that free riding is really the problem, is that as an individual, I can engage in behavior that might aggravate climate change marginally. But whatever harm, whatever cost, I get the full benefit of my behavior. But whatever cost that is incurred, that cost is not individual to me. It's something that I'm able to spread around and share with everybody else. So the benefits tend to outweigh the cost when you think about it in those terms. And that's seriously a problem with climate change. The costs are shared and free riding is possible. So for us just to understand climate change in context quickly, I'm going to run through a few quick slides here about the facts of climate change. And this is through the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's most recent fifth assessment that came out in 2014. And this is mostly based on the synthesis report. So the evidence is pretty strong, about as strong as you'd like it to be for causal relationships, that humans are changing the climate. and it is extremely likely that we are the dominant cause of warming since the mid-20th century. So the climate is changing, the climate is warming on average significantly. The data shows that, but it's not just that the climate's warming, there's significant evidence that we humans are the cause. If we look at globally average sea level change, we see the same sort of increase over a period of time as we do with global averages of land and sea in terms of temperature. We see that we also are experiencing significant sea level change over a relatively long period of time. And again, these are in meters, by the way, but what we see is that in any given year, or even on a decadal scale, they're not massive changes, right? We're not having a sort of equilibrium shift, some sort of significant event that's creating a substantial change in any given short period of time. But over a long period of time, between 1900 and 2000, in the past 100 years, we're seeing a relatively significant change in the average sea level, and that seems to be increasing. We also see that global anthropogenic CO2 emissions are increasing, and this is where you really identify the causal relationship between the human impact, how humans are causing climate change. And most of that is coming from fossil fuels, cement, and flaring. In terms of sources of emission, so we know that total emission, this is what it looks like. Proportionally, you see that energy production remains the primary driver of greenhouse gas emissions. So in 2010 numbers, 35% of greenhouse gas emissions was from the energy sector, about 24% from agriculture, forest, and other land uses, 21% industry, 14% transport, and about 6.5% from building sector. What this does is it suggests what area of human activity might we look at if we were to try to think about mitigating our influence, lowering our output in that. Certainly the energy sector and also agriculture, forest, and other uses are prime areas to focus on, especially if energy offers alternatives, if there's alternative ways to create energy availability for human use. In terms of projections of climate change, continued emissions of greenhouse gases will cause further warming and changes in the climate system. This is definitive. And so what does that mean? That means, generally speaking, oceans will continue to warm during the 21st century. Global mean sea level will continue to rise during the 21st century. It's very likely that the Arctic sea ice cover will continue to shrink and thin as global mean surface temperatures rises, and there's all kinds of feedbacks because of that that are not necessarily great things. Again, there are winners and losers, but for most of us who live in sort of the highly populated areas, especially here in the United States along coastal areas, it's not really the best news for us. And global glacier volume will further decrease. Again, adding to and reinforcing sea level rise, for example. Some of the potential impacts of climate change: food and water shortages, not really great. I mean, one of the real amazing things of human ingenuity over the past 10,000 years is the agricultural society, our ability to sort of stay in one place and start farming and tilling the land. That has produced a surplus, and certainly technology since the Industrial Revolution has ramped up that surplus. Our ability to figure out how to fix nitrogen and create fertilizer in a laboratory artificially in that way has been a significant improvement in terms of creating a massive amount of food availability. So the idea that there would be food and water shortages, I mean, right now we have a distribution problem, but to have a shortage problem globally with 7+ billion individuals is a scary thought. But also increased displacement of people. We've seen some climate refugees. We've seen examples of that. Katrina domestically, it's happened internationally, Indonesia, 2003, many different places. Increased poverty, coastal flooding, all significant issues. The highly technical summary, just as an aside, if we were to sort of sum all of this up in terms of climate change, it might be this, which is all of the scientists, the top eggheads at the United Nations and IPCC, buy a snorkel, right? There's your big, highly technical summary. And I give a thank you to Dr. Goodman, a colleague in the Department of Public Policy, for providing me with this character, with this illustration. Okay, so let's look at a climate change problem in context, specifically sea level rise. Insight number one, the first thing we should think about in terms of sea level rise as a problem or condition of climate change is that history really matters. If so, to get contextual, we need to think about sea level rise. Let's think about the history of human endeavors, especially here in the United States and specifically in the Northeast where we are. So history definitely matters. What do I mean by that? Our historical choices influence our choices today. Up here, you see the Charles River, you see what basically is Boston, and you see the evolution of Boston between 1630 and 1910. And in 1630, you have the original, sort of spit or peninsula of Boston, and you can see it, it's in white. And then over time, what you see is that Boston really is comprised of a lot of land reclamation. So you take submerged land, you fill it, and then you reclaim it. Back Bay, a massive piece. That was a bay, obviously, as we can see here. South Cove, Great Cove, Mill Pond, West Cove, all of these areas. What does this tell us? This tells us that Boston is an incredibly low-lying area. It has a history, so what I mean is it's right at sea level. It's literally glacial till. It's right at sea level, and most of these sort of intensely developed areas along this major metropolitan area in the Northeast is right at sea level and is a result of filling, a result of land reclamation. So that really matters, and the reason it matters, if we look over to the right side to the picture, we see Carson Beach here in Boston, and we see what I'll show you here is in a key on the right-hand side of shoreline years, and this is showing where the water meets the land under different years that have been measured. And Massachusetts has done a great job of this. But in 1893, the water met the sea here. Okay, I highlight that and expand it for you. So that's significant. So what this tells us is that most of this area is all, just like we see in the example of Boston here, is land reclamation. It's filling. It's a result of fill. But what we should also see is all of the development that surrounds it. And under conditions of climate change and sea level rise, what we can expect is that over time, I mean, this area is going to be significantly at risk. But these are major assets. A lot of human endeavor, a lot of human capital, and a lot of monetary value is locked up in this area. And that's significant. So the fact that we've chosen shoreline areas, right? We have a history of choosing to live right along the shoreline. And the additional fact that a lot of these areas are literally submerged wetlands that have been filled tells us that climate change can have a significant influence on our immediate well-being in the not too distant future because of our historical choices. Another example of that in terms of history matters, here I have another area of Massachusetts, coastal Massachusetts, Marshfield, right along Cape Cod Bay. And we can see here, it's very interesting, but we see a row of houses, right, along that run parallel to the beach. And then behind the houses, landward, we see salt marsh, right? We see what are wetland areas. And to sort of bear that out and understand what's going on, here I just highlighted in 1848, that's where the sea met the land. And then we have this situation where obviously humans have come in and they've developed this area, which included sort of filling in this wetland to make it habitable to allow for the development. And so there's some filling that goes on after 1848, probably after World War II. And then you have this expansion where you have the road and you have the infrastructure, sewage systems, whether that's the septic, etc. You have electricity grid. You have all of this put in, all of this infrastructure, and then you have the development of these homes right along the beach. And that kind of makes sense. What's interesting is that the second line, the blue line, is 1954. So we see that the filling obviously caused the water to move seaward, right? So the fill prevented the, the water line seaward away from. So if I think of these houses in relationship to this blue line, it kind of like makes sense, at least to a degree, because I can say, look, there's a decent amount of distance between what we've done, what we've built, the sort of where we've chosen to build it, even though it's reclaimed land, in relationship to where the water is. But then we can see the most recent, 2008, we see where the shoreline is. And the water has moved from 1954 right towards the buildings, right near the beach area. And that creates a significant change in the risk. So under conditions of climate change, our historical decision, again, to fill some of these areas and habitate along these coastal areas, which at the time might make a lot of sense. So in the context of the time and the understanding of what was going on in our basis of scientific information, climate change wasn't really well known in the 1950s, for example. Really certainly well understood in terms of a phenomenon that humans had some role to play, and sea level rise really wasn't truly well known at that time either. It might make some sense to do this, but now that we see where the water line is and we understand that climate change is certainly occurring, that sea level rise is certainly occurring, this becomes really dangerous. And so what that ends up looking like is, here's examples of our most recent storm here in early February, significant winter storm that we had. And this is some of the results along these houses in Marshfield. This is a house right along this line in Marshfield, and that's what it looks like. All of the sand has been removed, the light sand, and now these boulders are picked up by the water and thrown, literally hurled at the buildings like cannon shots. And it's pretty significant. This is the back of that same house. And this looks dangerous, right? I mean, this does not look like an area that's really safe, an area that you'd really want to be in. But what this provides is additional evidence that under conditions of climate change, we have to account for some of our historical choices. And then we have to reason out whether those choices make sense in the world today. This is Scituate, Massachusetts, which lies right next door to Marshfield, again along Cape Cod Bay. And what we can see here is that the water has moved significantly, right, towards our earlier development in Scituate. And it creates a very dangerous situation. You have very low-lying development right along the coastline. As the water moves landward, even with seawalls and some other revetments, some other opportunities to armor against the tide, I mean, this is dangerous. And everybody should identify this as immediately dangerous. This is not a place that if it was undeveloped, you would go to and look at it and say, this is a place to develop properties. This is where houses should be built. Here's another view of Scituate, and similar, and you can see better the seawall, and you can see that it's not really providing the protection. One thing it definitely is doing is it definitely takes away from any intertidal zone. That seawall prevents any of those coastal features, whether that be the sandy beach, or the dune area, or the Spartina, the line of vegetation, all of those normal sort of functions of what a normal beach area would look like in temperate New England along the coastline here are gone, because there's been a seawall to protect against and armor against the incoming tide, and the water has now hit up to that wall. Here's what Scituate looked like in the recent flooding event from that same winter storm we just had in early February 2015. Here's the after effects. Those are ice flows. But I mean, again, so this is what I'm trying to do with these pictures, is just show you the internalization of what is really a hazardous condition, a dangerous condition. This is internalizing some of the costs of climate change. This is really what it looks like. It's ground zero, what it looks like. And again, our history, our historical development is nobody came to this area and developed these homes under the conditions of assuming this, because they wouldn't build here, and we have to understand that. So our history really matters in how we look at these problems. Insight number 2 is perceptions matter. This tends to be what we look at and how we perceive a beach, right? We usually think of, hey, this is what, this property here, it's wonderful, it's amazing, it's desirable, it's right along the coastline, and usually it's because of the associated attributes of being along the coastline. What I mean by that is, so take the same house, right, and move that same house with the same footprint inland. It doesn't exist right along the coastline, but it's somewhere inland away from the coastline. And the question is, why is this house on the coastline? Why does it cost so much? If it was to go up for sale, its value, its fair market value, would be significantly more than the exact same structure, the exact same footprint, you know, the exact same land, say a half acre of land apiece, inland. And the question is why? Why is that? Why are we willing to put a premium on the house that's along the coastline? Location, location, location. Any realtor would tell you that. Most economists would tell you that as well, right? In terms of real estate value. I think one of the reasons is because this is what we see. We see, at least for the younger folks, right? We see this opportunity, right? We see this is the vision, at least part of the vision that we have when we think of the house along the coastline. It's wonderful, right? It's this opportunity for enjoyment, for recreation, and it just is something that we tend to desire as a group. What would be interesting is that instead of seeing just this in our mind's eye when we see the house on the coast, what if we saw something more like what I just put up here? What if we saw that as being the defining characteristic of some of these coastal areas? I wonder if our worldview, if our mental image would support a higher valuation for that property under that circumstances. To say that another way, what if when we saw that house on the coastline, we had an image of the dangerous coastline like this, and that was more akin to something like a volcano, right? In other words, the image in our mind, our worldview would associate that with something very dangerous, which would be like saying building a house along a volcano. I mean, nobody wants to do that, right? Because we know that, especially recently in Hawaii, that even if you put that house away, if you build a house away from the volcano, you're not at the caldera and the volcano's at the top of the volcano or its edge. Nobody builds there, right? Because it's extremely dangerous, and most of us agree it's a very dangerous place to be. But we still build houses near volcanoes, and even that's incredibly dangerous, as you can see here. So how we perceive the risk matters, right? How we think about what is a real risk and how we internalize that reality into our worldview, our sort of heuristics, our way of being, that really matters. The third insight is that incentives matter. We can look at incentives from different standpoints, but one is the public. What is the public's incentives? Well, under public policy, traditional theoretical underpinnings of public policy, the public is seen as disinterested. The public is somebody that, as a group, just doesn't really focus on any particular issue. They're generally disinterested. They focus on today. They love to capture immediate benefits, right? So if you can give them, like tax refunds, for example, very popular, right? Money coming back to you. So if government can dole out money to an individual and that individual can identify those benefits because they capture it themselves, as opposed to it going somewhere else. That's really important to the public. And then, generally speaking, if they can, the public tends to externalize costs. These are all assumptions about how the public operates, and they've been backed up through a lot of studies, sociological, psychological studies, behavioral studies about how human beings sort of perceive the world. And in terms of climate change, what we're asking is, please be aware, instead of disinterested, care about the future instead of focusing on today, and sacrifice. Sacrifice both in terms of capturing benefits today and in terms of being able to externalize costs. Literally, in climate change, in many ways, we're asking the public to do the opposite of what it does. And why are we asking that? Because remember, the foundations of climate change, the characteristics is that it occurs over time, it's uncertain, and the benefits are shared, right? That's how we need to perceive our actions towards climate change. In terms of politicians, so that's the public, but in terms of politicians, in terms of incentives. So here we have a couple of politicians, right? And we have to ask ourselves, here's politicians, here's the public, and how do politicians perceive the public? Well, generally, I think that they would probably identify, at least those that are well-informed, and through sort of some of these background conditions of the public, is that the public's disinterested, that it focuses on today, that it loves to capture benefits, and it loves to externalize costs. And the question is, so if that's how politicians view the voting public in general, what is it that motivates politicians to do something about something like climate change? It was a great study that was done by Healy and Malhorda back in 2009 in terms of how politicians react to disaster preparedness versus disaster relief. So do politicians vote to spend money on preparing for disaster, therefore avoiding or mitigating the effects of disaster? Or do they just focus on disaster relief, spending money after a disaster's occurred? Well, in terms of return on investment, so putting aside how politicians actually vote and where their incentives are, in terms of actual return on investment, in terms of disaster preparation, for every for every dollar of public money spent, $15 of benefits are yielded. It's a huge return on investment. It's a great way to spend public dollars, is in disaster preparation. Relief is a money loser. For every dollar that's invested, for every dollar of benefits that's accrued, public money has to be spent to the tune of $15.36. So the government has to spend $15.36 to get a return of investment of $1 in terms of disaster relief spending. So rationally, if we know this, it makes sense that politicians, of course, would constantly be focused on disaster preparation, voting for appropriations for disaster preparation, right? Using our money, our taxpayer money, very wisely. This is what we would do, right? In other words, if we go back to the original question, and this is what we actually will do. So politicians, what they will do is it's been shown that politicians wait for disaster to occur and they spend money on disaster relief. Because if you're a politician, you wait for a disaster to act even when it is way more expensive. And the reason why is because politicians are rewarded in votes, right? The public will vote favorably for politicians who spend money on disaster relief, but will not vote favorably for politicians who engage in disaster preparation. Some would say that's a perverse incentive, but that's the way it is. And it's important to understand that. And in terms of the government, so we have public, we have politicians, and now the government in general. So if we think of government in terms of this policy-making process, in terms of climate change, This is the foundation of the policymaking process, sort of how government actually goes through the process of making policy. It identifies a problem, it sets an agenda, develops proposals, builds support, enacts a law or rule, implements a policy, evaluates the results, and suggests changes. This sort of circular process, and then the suggestion of changes through the evaluation leads to a new problem identification or a slight different agenda if the goal is not being met. In terms of climate change, identifying the problem, never an issue. That's absolutely not an issue. Setting the agenda, really not an issue as well in terms of identifying exactly what should be done. Developing proposals, right? There's really good information to help us objectively develop proposals. The key issue most of the time through the government as a policymaking process for climate change is this building support. The difficulty, again, comes from what we just talked about in terms of politicians, is that it's hard to build support when the public's disinterested, when it focuses on today, when it loves to accrue benefits. And by the way, disaster relief is a perfect example of that. People get money paid directly to them through disaster relief. Whereas disaster preparedness, the money is distributed. You know, it's diffuse. You don't get that money directly paid to you. It's an investment in the future for all. And then, of course, externalizing costs. So it's really difficult when the public has these attributes for government to really move in this building of support, even though we understand the problem and we understand probably what needs to be done to help solve the problem. So from the political perspective, when we think about it from government, is that, you know, I'll do whatever it takes. So if you tell me that you're going to vote for me, that I will get your vote if I focus only on disaster relief spending, for example, then I'm going to focus on that because that's what you're telling me I should do. So government very much is a function of the incentives of the individuals that help to make government, which includes the public and includes the politicians. And we need to understand that. We really do need to understand how these incentives drive outcomes. What this means is that we would have a problem in actually passing meaningful climate change legislation through the policymaking cycle because we can't get to the enactment of a law or rule simply because it's difficult to build support from the public. The relationship between the public and the politician responding to public incentives, or what the public is telling the politicians, really sort of mucks things up at this point. And the real reasons for that are the characteristics of climate change. So in our inability to get to this section that's highlighted in the blue circle is really sort of problematic and mainly caused, or the sort of example of how this comes out is that, you know, hey, we announce a target for climate change, we don't really make a plan even though we know what to do, we do nothing, and then of course it fails. And that failure only reinforces the failure to do something. It says that, look, it's a lost cause, it's something we can't really control, we can't do much about it. And so we have this sort of vicious cycle. But those cycles are really embedded, at least in my view, and I think it's supported by a lot of literature, in the incentives that drive individual and group decision making. So the results are government gives us reasons to discount new facts, previous policy directions. We are programmed to discount new facts like climate change. And politicians have no strong reason to make us act differently. I mean, that's really the result. So what I would do versus what I will do, to revisit, if you saw a problem, would you fix it? Not if it doesn't affect me today. Would you do something today to prevent harm tomorrow? Not if there aren't immediate rewards for me. And would you use relevant information in making an important decision? Maybe if the information fits my worldview, no if it does not. So that's currently where we stand in terms of what I would do versus what I will do vis-a-vis climate change. So what to do about that problem? Well, if we look at the policymaking process, we need to really focus on this building support. This is the logjam, I think, at this moment in terms of meaningful climate change legislation. It's not about the facts. It's all about how the facts affect our current worldviews. So we need to overcome our history. We need to understand our history and appreciate it, but we need to overcome it. We can't say, look, we are committed to living in these very sensitive areas simply because historically we've chosen to do so. And therefore, we must do everything we can to rebuild in these areas that have been disaster areas as climate change is occurring and as sea level rise is occurring. We must commit to rebuilding and putting further resources in terms of disaster relief, for example, throwing good money after bad, essentially. So we have to think about our history. We need to alter our perceptions, how we perceive the world, right? So we can't think that this always equals the great thing. We probably need to think that in some coastal areas, it's more like living near a volcano, and we need to see incentives differently. So what that means is that instead of thinking just about today, I need to think more about tomorrow. Thank you so much.